Geschätzte
Dear hosts, ladies and gentlemen, at first I would like to thank you for the invitation. It is a great honor to be here today. And as a chancellor, often you have the chance of speaking in front of an audience, but several hundred journalists and newspaper people, well, this is a first for me, a premiere of sorts. So thank you very much for allowing me to share some ideas with you, and maybe even to share some ideas about the challenges that lie ahead for media and politics at the moment. The relationship between media and politics is not a very easy one, I would say. It is quite diverse. We need each other somehow. And sometimes we're a bit upset about each other. You quarrel here and there. And during electoral campaigns or on trips abroad, you get the impression that you see the press more often than your own family members or relatives. So, of course, there are not only the things that separate us, but there's also a lot of things that unite us, that unites politics and the media. And I think the first thing has already been addressed by you, namely the subject of freedom of the press. Freedom of the press is indispensable for functioning democracy, and in my task as a foreign minister 5 or 6 years ago, I became aware of the fact what freedom of the press actually means if you grow up as a young European with a pluralistic media landscape, and in Europe with politicians who are sometimes maybe upset or make one or the other, flippant comment, but no more than that for the media. And if you see how the situation is in other parts of the world, you quickly learn how important freedom of the press is and how important it is for functioning democracy. In all of my travels as a foreign minister, I always noticed one thing. Wherever the press or freedom of opinion was at risk, democracy was at risk. And wherever there was no freedom of the press or freedom of opinion, there was no functioning democracy. And something that we should not underestimate is the courage of people who stand up for free speech, freedom of the press, and for diversity in other parts of the world, because sometimes this is linked with extreme risks and sanctions. It has been said, quite rightly, that the freedom of the press in Europe, in the USA, and in Western democracies is not all that easy anymore. And I admit that in Austria, on the left and on the right wing of the political spectrum, there are always some comments and commentaries that shouldn't happen or shouldn't exist that way. And as a politician, you're often tempted, of course, to do just that. Sometimes you feel treated unfairly, and of course you believe that something you should be added or that we should protest. And thanks to the social media, thanks to the possibility of reaching millions of people through the social media, of course the temptation is even bigger. So I believe it is important, or even more important, not to focus on your own feelings, but to actually rein yourself in and to admit that freedom of the press is much more important than being right or being righteous or commenting or opposing somebody's view. Furthermore, what unites us, apart from the freedom of the press, is a number of challenges, because at the beginning it's been said that this increasing technology is not only changing our world, but is also changing the way we communicate. Technical progress, social media, and the possibility of reaching millions of people directly has changed a lot for politics. The challenge of how to deal with fake news. Sometimes we're being polarized on the left and right, those on top, those at the bottom, politicians and the population. So this is something that politicians are often grappling with. And at the same time, it is an extreme challenge for the media. So for you, there is a new way thanks to your online presence and owing to new competition from GAFA, Google, Amazon, Facebook, and others. So what we are trying to do is to create a level playing field. And during the Council presidency of Austria in the European Union in the past 6 months, we have really stood up for the copyright regulations, and we are very glad that it's been adopted now, because as a conservative party, we focus on ownership, on property, not only that you in the land register, but it's also intellectual property that is part and parcel of ownership. And I believe that this goes in the right direction, and I hope that the established media companies across Europe will find their work a bit easier now as a consequence. And we have to go a bit further in terms of fair taxation. The media industry and bakeries and the carpenters, everybody, all companies have a taxation of 20 to 25%. Digital companies, the GAFA, they have about maybe 10% taxation. That's a big difference. So there's no level playing field. What we are doing in Austria is we're the first country in Europe, together with the French, more or less, we are introducing taxes not to increase the burden of taxation in general, but to create a level playing field. So the money we are getting from this tax is invested in order to move forward in the area of freedom of the press, and we believe that these things should be supported by this tax revenue. The third thing that we want to underline is the joint responsibility that we have. I'm not very old, I'm only 32 years old, but I think that I have been shaping and following the developments here in Austria. And what I'm seeing here in Austria, and it's the same in other European countries, and I think it also applies to the US, that the tone of political debate and also of the debate in the media is getting rougher. And I have the feeling that it is anger, that it's discrediting of others, that is ever more in the increase, and that there's often, well, people are put in drawers. So they're either left or right, or at the top or the bottom. Those who have to be protected and those have to be fought. So I think that is a big problem of the political debate, because for political culture to be preserved, because it shouldn't be lost. And it's also a challenge in the debate that is taking place in the media. And I believe that as politicians and as the media, we're sitting in the same boat, because the more we're capable of keeping up certain quality standards and the more pleasantly we're dealing with each other, the better it is for democracy, for rule of law, for freedom of the press and freedom of speech, and for our coexistence. I think what is now changing very much is the role of the media in the political discourse. A few decades ago, the major task of education had been to provide information for all. My grandparents, who grew up in a small village in Lower Austria with very few inhabitants and not really a lot of access to big cities or big institutions, they relied on the daily paper in order to get their information. Today, almost everybody has almost unlimited access to information, and that is completely free of charge. All you need to do is switch on your cell phone. So now we need to focus on quality, focus on facts, and also maybe ensure that different opinions can make themselves heard. And I think the more fact-based this is and the higher the quality, the better it is for the population to consume the media. That's not only economically better for the media, but also better for our democratic discourse. I believe that it is not only the media have a great responsibility, but also the politicians. In this changing world, we have a big responsibility. Now, let me share a last idea with you. And 2 weeks before the European elections, I believe this is an essential one. I was the foreign minister of Austria for 4 years, and I was traveling all over the world. And of course, there were our economic interests, our bilateral interests, but also our basic values: democracy, rule of law, opinion, freedom of opinion, free speech, freedom of the press. That's what makes Austria and Europe livable. And I think in most parts of the world it was very easy advertising for these values among the population, but often also among the decision makers. And the reason for this, unfortunately, had not been that the decision makers all over the world have such a strong desire for freedom of the individual, or that everybody focuses on free speech and freedom of the press. No, the reason was that mostly our model of way of life was accompanied by a promise of more prosperity. In the Western Balkans, well, when I advertised our basic values, that was easy to do because the population as well as the politicians in the Western Balkans knew that a rapprochement with the European Union meant growth and more prosperity for all. A country such as Ukraine that can look both towards Russia and the European Union, well, everybody knows that looking towards the European Union promises not only more freedom, more rule of law, less corruption, but also a promise of more prosperity that Russia currently maybe cannot fulfill. And of course, you can also continue like this and apply it to the entire world. And sometimes it has been easy for me and my colleagues to advertise for our fundamental values. Currently, what we're seeing is that other states on this planet are also extremely successful. They are catching up. They are sometimes passing us, and that based on a completely different system. A few weeks ago, I was at the Belt and Road Forum in China. Incredible developments, economic growth of 6%, and hundreds of millions of people who were, well, brought out of poverty. And all of that happened using another system. Neither a democratic system nor the rule of law the way we know it, and not based on freedom of the press or freedom of the media or free speech. I think that these European elections are quite decisive, and they determine the future direction, because we are all obliged to do everything we can to ensure that we, as the European Union, remain successful in the long term. Because if we can't succeed in being competitive, of being successful, if we can't succeed in maintaining the prosperity level that we have achieved, it's going to get increasingly difficult to export our fundamental values all over the world. I believe when it comes to that question, we're all in the same boat. European media houses need to be successful, but also the entire European economy needs to be strong. And the prosperity we have built up needs to be preserved. Because if we fail to share our fundamental values, and if we can't sell it with our economic success and our quality of life, exporting these fundamental values will become increasingly difficult. And I think this would be to the detriment not only of the European Union, but also of all other parts of this world. So along these lines, I would like to wish all of us in Europe all the best, but also to you, the newspaper media makers, as journalists who are making such a strong, big contribution to the European Union. I wish you a lot of success in your work that is anything but easy. I hope that this Congress will offer you an opportunity not only for an exchange, but also to make you more competitive and stronger. And in light of all these strenuous activities, if you need a couple of days to relax, please do come back to Austria. As a chancellor, of course, you're also an honorary ambassador for our tourism advertising industry, so you're always welcome, not only for this Congress, of course, but also on other occasions. Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation.